Morning sunlight spilled softly across the linen curtains, casting golden lines on the walls of the room Grace now called home. The quiet hum of life in Randall's mansion was unlike anything she had ever known. No alarms, no traffic outside her window, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, only birdsong and the faint aroma of fresh coffee wafting from the kitchen below. Grace sat up slowly, her body still adjusting to the rhythm of peace. For so many years, mornings had been a struggle, a reminder of what was missing. First, her husband Robert's passing had left a hollow silence in their old house. Then, the fire had taken everything else. Her memories, her possessions, her sense of belonging. She still sometimes woke with the smell of smoke in her dreams, reaching for things that no longer existed. But here, in this house built by the man she once loved and somehow found again, life felt different. Randall's home wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. The sunlit halls, the scent of cedar and roses, the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen when Randall teased the housekeeper, Maria. Everything here spoke of warmth and care, the kind she thought time had taken from her forever. She slipped on her robe and walked to the balcony. The garden stretched out in perfect harmony, bursting with color, lavender, hydrangeas, and climbing roses that reached toward the light. Grace took a deep breath and smiled. 6 months ago, she had been sleeping in a budget hotel, wondering how she'd survive another day. Now, she felt like she'd stepped into the kind of peace people only dream of. Randall had given her more than a roof. He'd given her space to breathe, to heal, to rediscover who she was beyond loss. Still, there was a shadow in her heart that refused to fade completely, the ache of her son, David. She hadn't heard from him since the day she walked away from his perfect house with her suitcase and her pride barely intact. As she looked across the garden, Grace felt the tension building quietly inside her. Love had returned to her life in a way she'd never expected, but motherhood left an emptiness that even Randall's warmth couldn't fill. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I've rebuilt my life, but why does it still feel unfinished?" The breeze answered softly, as if promising, because your story isn't over yet. The morning felt like any other peaceful day in Grace's new life. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the living room, illuminating the vase of fresh lilies she was arranging on the polished oak table. The scent of flowers mixed with the faint aroma of Randall's coffee drifting from the kitchen, creating a calm so perfect it almost felt unreal. She hummed softly to herself, trimming a stem, when the sound of the doorbell cut through the silence. It wasn't the soft chime she expected from friends or deliveries. It was firm, uncertain, almost hesitant. Grace froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. Randall was out meeting a client, and few people ever visited unannounced. Wiping her hands on a towel, she walked toward the door, her slippers whispering against the hardwood floor. Each step felt heavier than it should have. Some instinct deep inside told her that whoever stood on the other side of that door would change her peace forever. When she opened it, the world seemed to pause. Standing there was her son, David. Time had not been kind to him. His once carefully combed hair was unkempt, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. In his hands, he held a bouquet of red roses, their petals trembling slightly in the morning breeze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of distance and silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. "Mom," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. I needed to see you." Grace's throat tightened. She gripped the edge of the door for balance, torn between joy and pain. Memories flooded her mind, the night she had stood on his doorstep, asking for shelter, and the coldness in his eyes when he turned her away. The wound still lived deep inside her, even after finding happiness again. "Why now, David?" she whispered. "After all this time?" He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "Because I made a mistake," he said softly. "Victoria left. And when she did, I realized I'd lost more than her. I lost you." The roses trembled in his hands. Grace stared at them, symbols of apology and regret. She wanted to slam the door. She wanted to pull him into her arms. Instead, she simply said, "You'd better come in." And as he stepped inside, the silence between them carried every word they hadn't said in years. David stood just inside the doorway, clutching the bouquet of roses as if they were the only thing holding him together. Grace led him to the sitting room, her movements slow, measured. She gestured toward the couch, and for a moment, he hesitated before sitting down, his posture stiff with guilt. The room was filled with quiet warmth, soft sunlight, the faint hum of the grandfather clock, and the subtle scent of flowers she had just arranged. But beneath that calm, tension pulsed like a heartbeat. "I didn't know where else to go," David began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria left. She said she couldn't live with a man who didn't know how to love anyone but himself." He gave a bitter laugh, one that quickly turned into something closer to a sob. "I thought I was building a life. But all I built were walls." Grace sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She studied the lines on his face, lines that hadn't been there the last time she saw him. He looked older, smaller somehow, as if the weight of regret had pressed down on him until all the arrogance and pride had drained away. "When I came to your house that night," she said quietly, "all I needed was a place to rest. I didn't ask for anything more." Her words trembled despite her calm tone. "And you told me there wasn't room." David shut his eyes, his jaw tightening. "I know. And I think about that night every single day." He ran a hand through his hair, the way he used to when he was a boy caught lying about something small. "You stood there with your suitcase and I listened to her instead of my heart. I told myself it was about privacy, about boundaries. But really, I was just too proud to admit I needed you as much as you needed me." Grace felt her chest tighten. Her heart ached for him, but anger still flickered beneath her compassion. "You turned me away, David. You left me when I had nothing." "I know," he whispered. "And I'd give anything to change that." For a long time, they sat in silence, two souls bound by love and broken by pride. Grace saw the man her son had become, but behind his weary eyes, she finally glimpsed the frightened boy he once was. And in that moment, her heart began, slowly, painfully, to soften. Grace led David through the hall, the quiet echo of their footsteps mingling with the soft hum of the morning. The air carried a comforting mix of lemon polish and freshly brewed coffee, the familiar scent of a home well kept. To Grace, it smelled like peace. To David, it smelled like distance, a life rebuilt without him. He glanced around, taking in the house that seemed to radiate a kind of gentle sophistication. The polished wood floors, the photographs of gardens and sunlight, the soft throw blankets folded neatly on the sofa. Everything spoke of stability and care. He swallowed hard, realizing this was not the life of a broken woman. His mother, who once stood trembling on his doorstep, now moved with quiet confidence, her shoulders straight, her eyes steady. "This is nice," he said awkwardly, his voice barely masking the ache of surprise. "It's home," Grace replied simply. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it gently in front of him. "I wasn't sure you'd ever see it." David looked down at the steam curling from the cup. "I didn't think you'd want me to." Grace sat across from him, studying his face, the fine lines of exhaustion, the bruised look of guilt behind his eyes. "You didn't think much about what I wanted at all," she said softly. Her words were calm, but they cut deep. David winced. "You're right," he admitted. "I thought I was protecting my life. I didn't see that I was destroying yours." Grace wanted to be angry, to hold on to the resentment that had kept her strong. She wanted to remind him of that night, the cold air, her suitcase, the door closing in her face. But now, looking at him, she saw not cruelty but regret. Not pride but pain. She took a slow breath. "You know, for months, I told myself I didn't need you. That I'd moved on. And I did. But that doesn't mean it stopped hurting." He nodded, his eyes wet. "I know, Mom. I can't fix the past, but I want to be part of your future, if you'll let me." Grace stared at him in silence. Forgiveness or bitterness, both lived in her heart, battling quietly. Finally, she said, her voice trembling but kind, "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, David, but I can start by offering you a seat at my table." And for the first time, the wound between them began to breathe. The quiet between them stretched as they sat in the warm glow of the kitchen. The tick of the wall clock filled the silence, slow and deliberate. David's eyes drifted around again, to the photos on the counter, the fine china on the shelves, the comfortable lived-in feel of the home. Finally, his gaze rested on a picture frame near the window. In it, Grace was laughing beside a tall, silver-haired man whose arm rested easily around her shoulders. David frowned. "Mom," he began carefully, "whose house is this?" Grace hesitated, her hand tightening around her coffee mug. She met his eyes and said, softly but firmly, "It's mine, and Randall's." The air seemed to thicken. David blinked, as if he hadn't heard her right. "Randall," he repeated, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "The man who picked you up from that hotel?" "Yes," she replied. Her voice was steady, calm. "The man who opened his door when you closed yours." David's expression darkened. He looked away, jaw tight. "So you just moved in with him? You barely knew him." Grace exhaled slowly, the hurt in his tone cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. "I've known Randall longer than you think. 40 years ago, he was my first love. We lost touch, but fate brought him back when I needed someone most." David's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with something far more complicated. Jealousy. Not the kind born of rivalry, but of loss. For the first time, he realized someone else had stepped into the space he once held in his mother's heart. "So that's it," he murmured. "You've replaced me?" Grace's heart clenched. "David, no. You can't replace family. But you can lose their trust. And when that happens, sometimes someone else fills the silence you leave behind." He looked at her, guilt twisting his features. "I was supposed to be the one you turned to." Grace met his gaze, her voice soft but edged with truth. "You were, David. But when I needed you, you weren't there." She paused, the words she'd carried for months finally finding release. "Randall answered when you didn't." The room went still. The truth hung between them, heavy, undeniable, and painfully real. The soft creak of the front door broke the uneasy silence that had settled between Grace and David. A moment later, Randall's familiar voice called out, calm and warm, "Grace? I'm home." David straightened in his chair, his body tensing as if bracing for a storm. Grace looked toward the doorway, her expression uncertain. When Randall appeared, dressed in his usual navy sweater and carrying his briefcase, he froze at the sight before him. Grace and her son sitting at opposite ends of the kitchen table, eyes red, untouched cups of coffee growing cold. Randall's gaze shifted between them, and though he said nothing, he seemed to understand everything. Setting his briefcase aside, he walked to the counter, filled the kettle, and began to make fresh coffee. The simple, unhurried act softened the air. He poured a cup for David first, sliding it across the table with a quiet smile. "Long day?" he asked gently. David hesitated before nodding. "You could say that." Randall sat down across from him, his tone steady and kind. "Grace tells me you've been talking." David's voice wavered. "Trying to, at least." Randall leaned back, folding his hands. "That's a good start. Talking takes more courage than most people think." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You know, I've made my share of mistakes too. Hurt people I cared about. Thought success could fix everything, but it doesn't. It just makes the silence louder." Grace glanced at Randall, gratitude flickering in her eyes. His presence had a way of grounding the moment, easing the sharp edges. David stared into his coffee. "I thought I was protecting my life, my relationship, but I ended up pushing away the only person who ever stood by me." Randall nodded slowly. "We all fall short. The difference between pride and love is simple. One builds walls, the other builds bridges. You just have to decide which one you want to keep building." David looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time without defense. "I want to fix this, Mom. I don't know how, but I want to try." Grace's throat tightened, her eyes glistening. Randall smiled softly. "Then start here," he said. "At this table. No judgment. Just truth." And for the first time in years, the space between mother and son didn't feel like distance. It felt like possibility. The house was quiet that night, wrapped in the soft glow of lamplight. Randall had gone upstairs to read, giving Grace and David space to finish what had begun earlier that day. Outside, a gentle rain tapped against the windows, a rhythm that seemed to echo the weight in the room. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded loosely around a cup of chamomile tea. Across from her, David sat in silence, his face half-lit by the lamp. He looked like a man fighting a war inside himself, between shame and longing, pride and love. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock. Then David exhaled shakily, as if letting go of something he'd been holding for years. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking. "I was so wrong." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. They were filled with tears, raw, unguarded tears that stripped away the last of his pride. "I thought I was being strong," he continued. "I told myself I was protecting my life with Victoria. But I wasn't strong. I was weak. I was selfish." He buried his face in his hands. "You came to me for help, and I turned you away. I've replayed that night 1,000 times, wishing I could go back, wishing I just said, 'Come in, Mom.'" Grace's heart trembled. She had imagined hearing these words, but never truly believed she would. Slowly, she reached across the table and rested her hand over his. "David," she whispered, her voice tender but firm, "forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about freeing your own heart." He looked up, eyes glistening. "Can you forgive me?" She smiled faintly, tears welling in her own eyes. "I already did. The day I chose to stop hating you, I forgave you, even if you didn't know it yet." David's shoulders shook as the last of his defenses crumbled. He stood, walked to her side, and fell to his knees, pressing his forehead against her arm like a child seeking comfort. Grace's arms wrapped around him instinctively, pulling him close. For the first time in years, mother and son held each other. No words, no explanations, just shared grief and love healing old wounds. In that quiet kitchen, beneath the sound of rain and forgiveness, the past finally began to let go. The golden afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the dining room table. The scent of roasted herbs and fresh bread filled the air as Grace and Randall set out the dishes for dinner. David was already there, helping without being asked, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. The sight made Grace's heart ache in the sweetest way. Randall poured wine into their glasses, his movements calm and deliberate. David watched them quietly, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was something different in his mother now, a quiet joy that radiated from within her, the kind of peace he had never seen when she lived alone or even when his father was alive. "Mom," David said after a long silence, "I need to tell you something." Grace looked up, her expression open, patient. "What is it, dear?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "For a long time, I thought love was about comfort, about having someone who fit neatly into my life. But watching you and Randall, I realize it's not that at all. It's about patience, kindness, sacrifice. It's about showing up, even when it's inconvenient." Randall smiled gently, his eyes meeting Grace's across the table. "Your mother has taught me a few of those lessons too," he said. David laughed softly, though his eyes shone with emotion. "I used to think you were fragile after Dad died, Mom. I didn't see how strong you really were, how you carried everything without asking for help." His voice faltered. "But now, seeing you here, I finally understand what love really means." Grace reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "It took me a long time to learn too," she said softly. "Sometimes love doesn't look the way we expect. Sometimes it finds us after everything else burns away." For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the faint chirping of crickets outside. Grace looked around the room, at the man who had kept his promise after 40 years, and the son who had found his way back home. The woman who once stood before the ashes of her old life now stood surrounded by everything that truly mattered: love, forgiveness, and family. And for the first time in years, her heart felt completely free. The golden afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the dining room table. The scent of roasted herbs and fresh bread filled the air as Grace and Randall set out the dishes for dinner. David was already there, helping without being asked, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. The sight made Grace's heart ache in the sweetest way. Randall poured wine into their glasses, his movements calm and deliberate. David watched them quietly, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was something different in his mother now, a quiet joy that radiated from within her, the kind of peace he had never seen when she lived alone or even when his father was alive. "Mom," David said after a long silence, "I need to tell you something." Grace looked up, her expression open, patient. "What is it, dear?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "For a long time, I thought love was about comfort, about having someone who fit neatly into my life. But watching you and Randall, I realize it's not that at all. It's about patience, kindness, sacrifice. It's about showing up, even when it's inconvenient." Randall smiled gently, his eyes meeting Grace's across the table. "Your mother has taught me a few of those lessons too," he said. David laughed softly, though his eyes shone with emotion. "I used to think you were fragile after Dad died, Mom. I didn't see how strong you really were, how you carried everything without asking for help." His voice faltered. "But now, seeing you here, I finally understand what love really means." Grace reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "It took me a long time to learn too," she said softly. "Sometimes love doesn't look the way we expect. Sometimes it finds us after everything else burns away." For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the faint chirping of crickets outside. Grace looked around the room, at the man who had kept his promise after 40 years, and the son who had found his way back home. The woman who once stood before the ashes of her old life now stood surrounded by everything that truly mattered: love, forgiveness, and family. And for the first time in years, her heart felt completely free. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and blooming roses. Grace walked slowly through Randall's garden, the same garden she had admired from her balcony the first day she arrived. Now, months later, it felt like sacred ground, a place where her broken life had quietly taken root and grown back into something beautiful. Each flower she passed seemed to tell a story: the lilacs that Randall had planted for her, the sunflowers that stood tall like promises of brighter days, the white roses that symbolized peace. The colors were more vivid now, or maybe she was just finally able to see them clearly. She paused near the fountain, watching the sunlight dance across the water's surface. Her reflection stared back at her, older, wiser, but gentler too. For years, she had carried grief like a shadow, believing the best chapters of her life were long behind her. But now, standing amidst the beauty she'd helped nurture, Grace realized that the fire which once destroyed her home had also purified her soul. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "The fire took my home, but it also burned away everything false, pride, pain, and fear." Randall's footsteps approached from behind, steady and familiar. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Talking to the flowers again," he teased gently. Grace smiled, leaning against him. "They listen better than most people." Randall chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "They've got competition. I'm a pretty good listener myself." Her laughter blended with the morning breeze, light and unburdened. "You've been more than that," she said. "You gave me a place to heal, to remember who I was before the world told me to be small." He squeezed her hand. "You did that yourself, Grace. I just opened the door." In the distance, she saw David walking toward them, holding a tray of coffee. The sight filled her with warmth. Mother, son, and the man who had once been her first love, all together, not perfect, but whole. As they sat beneath the garden's old oak tree, Grace looked up at the sky, sunlight filtering through the branches. Sometimes, she thought, destruction isn't an ending. It's an invitation. A chance to rebuild, to bloom again, to find the light waiting beyond the smoke. And in that moment, she knew, her story had come full circle.